So hi everybody, thanks for being here. Can you hear me fine? So thanks for the university for inviting me. Thanks a lot to President Fasser for organizing my whole visit. I'm going to be here for 2 weeks, so a bunch of activities planned for me. I'm looking forward to talking to a lot more people. So I want to talk about learning the practice of monetary policy, so really the hands-on practice of policy, not the theoretical things that I learned before, and give some takeaways from being exposed to it for the first time very recently, so I'll explain why. So when Christian invited me to talk here, first I was a little surprised, and I thought, what's going to be my contribution here? Because although I work for the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas, in the US, if you look at my research, it's not really about monetary policy. But as you'll see, I got to get some hands-on experience recently. Before I talk about this, I just want to say this usual disclaimer that everything I'm going to say today, the slides, my answers to questions, it's all my own views and not necessarily reflective of the Dallas Fed or the Federal Reserve System in general. So to give you some background, the way the Fed works, before I start going more into detail, there's one entity in DC, the Board of Governors, with 7 governors on this board, led by the chair, Jerome Powell. You may have heard his name. And then in addition to this board, there's 12 independent Federal Reserve banks in the rest of the US. And pretty much each of these banks covers some territory, a district, and they represent the district. So the Dallas Fed, where I work, represents the Texas, but also part of Louisiana. And so every 6 weeks or so, the president of each of these 12 banks meet in DC with the governors, and they talk about policy, and they decide what they're going to do in terms of the interest rate, guiding, saying what they think the future is going to have in terms of interest, etc. And the way it works at the Dallas Fed is that each economist like me, we're assigned one of these meetings. So for 6 weeks, I went from having pretty little idea about the practice of monetary policy to having to brief the Dallas Fed president about the data that came in for these 6 weeks, analysis on this data, and pretty much what should be the stance of the president of the Dallas Fed coming to the November meeting in DC. Okay, that was just this last November. So I got to learn a lot. And I thought today what would be interesting for people who most of you, I guess, are outsiders, you haven't worked in a central bank. What for me was surprising and what lessons did I learn? You'll see none of this is going to be new for somebody who's worked, I think, in a central bank or has been involved in policy, but could be surprising for others. But before I do that, I wanted to give some background on inflation in the US to give some perspective. There's some similarities, Colombia, of course, some differences. So let's start with, the inflation rate in the first place. Where are we? So here I show you the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. It's the PCE, price index. So year-over-year inflation since the 60s up to now. And so in June of this year, we reached in the US a 40-year high, which was around 7%. On one hand, it's not extraordinarily high if you look at past history in the US, right? In the 70s and the 80s, the inflation rate was up to 12% almost. So it's not crazy in that sense. But at the same time, if you look at what was happening in the past 20 years, it is much, much, much higher. To give even more background, the Fed has 2 mandates, 2 official mandates as a central bank. The first one being price stability, and the second one being maximum employment. And the way price stability is interpreted now is trying to target 2% inflation rate, more or less, right? So It's fine if sometimes we're above, then we can have sometimes being below it, but on average, in the long run, the US should have around 2% inflation rate. So obviously, 7% it's way too high, right? So the Fed always says that these days it's unacceptably high. So the reasons, again, I'm sure most of you know that, but what made this episode really hard to tackle is this mix of supply and demand side factors. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered a bunch of inflation fueling factors, starting with supply side disruptions, lockdowns, closing factories, lockdowns meaning that ships were stuck in harbors, couldn't deliver materials, etc. A lot of pressure on the supply, prices go up. Now in the US, what was maybe specific is that in the face of these hardships for businesses, for households who lost their jobs, who were sick, etc., there were unprecedented support packages. So in fact, since the beginning of COVID-19 in the US, there was more than $6 trillion spent to support households and businesses. To give some background, it's around 24% of 1 year of GDP in the US. So it's it's extremely large. Okay, so you can think of this as adding some demand side inflation in that it really replenished the pockets of households. It was necessary, most likely, right? It was really helpful for those people, but it added another factor. Something else in the US, I'd be super interested to learn more about the situation in Colombia, but in the US, one of the big problems still is a long-lasting shortage of labor. We thought it would be transitory at some point, that people would maybe were sick, would come back to work. But even by now, we still have a pretty depressed participation rate, so people left the labor force and didn't come back. It's a little hard to figure out why. There could be a change in preferences in terms of what kind of work you want to do. There could be a change also in how much work you need to do, given the support that the government gave. We can see that people in the US still have very high savings thanks to this stimulus packages. I don't know how shocking it could be for you, but a number that at the Fed was really important for us is to think of in the middle of this year of 2022, for each person that was looking for a job, there were 2 job openings. So you could go out there and there would be 2 jobs waiting for you. Maybe not the jobs you want, and maybe not the location you want, but that's a lot because typically in the US, we would have around 0.7 jobs per person. So not 1 job for each person, right? And then some of these factors were made worse by the war in Ukraine, especially the supply constraints, just accentuated all of that. I show here a graph that I thought was interesting by Adam Shapiro from the San Francisco Fed. He tried to disentangle the supply-driven and demand-driven inflation in the US. And the way it does it is smart, but it's pretty simple. You want to identify if you see an increase in prices, whether it comes from supply or demand. You go back to Econ 101, and if it's supply-driven, you should see the price go up and quantities go up at the same time. Demand-driven, prices go up, but quantities go down. So he looked at all the increases in prices across 100 different products, and every time he checked how quantities were moving at the same time. And then he was able to make that graph. I think one interesting thing is that in 2022, you can see the blue part, which is demand-driven inflation, at the bottom, was negative, which means that if there was no supply-driven inflation, we would actually have had deflation, so prices would have gone down. But supply-driven inflation was high enough to have positive inflation. And then we have this big reversal here, mid-2021 to now, where now demand-driven inflation really picked up, and supply-driven inflation didn't decrease very much, so it kept increasing actually, hence the situation where the US is right now. So in light of what was happening, the Fed reacted. Now, a lot of people would say maybe reacted late or later than optimal, but it's, I mean, always easier to look back. So originally, the thought was, if inflation comes from the supply constraints coming from COVID-19 especially, well, eventually they're going to resorb by themselves, and so we should be back to normal. Of course, as a Fed, you can also increase interest rates and crush demand, which would work too, right? You could, it doesn't really matter where inflation comes from. You can always increase interest rates and try to bring inflation down. But if you believe that inflation is going to come down anyways by itself, you'd prefer to not have to crush demand, right? So that was the theory. So it would be transitory, we just have to wait. Well, at some point it became clear that action was necessary. So there was this steep increase in the interest rate, in the Fed funds rate, which is the tool that the Fed uses, starting in March of 2022. If you look at the big picture, once again, it doesn't look that crazy compared to the 70s, the 80s. But what was really special is the speed at which it happened. We went from 0 lower bound to 4% in just a few months. So if you zoom into since the 2000, you can see how steep the increase has been. Okay, it's really what's been notable. So again, if you compare to Colombia, I was looking at the rate increases in Colombia recently. It's not that much. So we've had 4 75 basis point hikes. I think in Colombia there have been several 100 basis points hikes. But in the context of the US, that's already a lot. And there's concerns of destabilizing financial markets especially, right? So I focus on interest rates. There's other parts to monetary policy in the US. So as I said, every other meetings where they vote on the interest rate, they also publish a forecast of future interest rate increases, as well as a forecast of how the economy will be doing. Is a summary of economic projections. So you can think of it as forward guidance. Is the Fed saying, really, this is what we think will happen in the future. Therefore, it will not really be a surprise in the future if this happens. So it's a way to already kind of tell economic agents to expect some of those changes. Also, balance sheet reduction, which means the Fed has also been pretty much stopped buying assets that they were buying beforehand. I won't go into details, but that's 2 additional factors here. So okay, that's what the background. Now, what did I learn from just knowing the theory of monetary policy that you learn in grad school to having to brief our president on what was happening? So to give this lesson, let's start with maybe how you would think, or maybe how I would think, that monetary policy would go in a world where everything is simple, there's no information frictions. Something happens like COVID-19, you would look at what's happening in the economy, right? Assess the conditions, and then you would just implement the policy you think is going to bring the economy back to where you want to go. So I think the second point, I knew that that's difficult, because I knew that it's not that easy to know what policy do you do to bring the economy back. Maybe the biggest surprise for me is the first point is already extremely difficult. And I feel like in school I never really learned about how much of a challenge it is to measure the economy. And there's a lot of research actually that still is done and can be done about this. Especially it's hard to measure the economy at high frequency. When you're in a time of crisis, I realize you really want to get data as soon as possible. Let's say you do something, you do an action, you want to know how did it impact the economy, right? So that's really a difficulty. Second, point 2 is difficult because the mapping from one policy action, let's say increase rates by 50 basis points, to outcome on the economy changes all the time. Maybe in the 70s, you would increase rate by 50 basis points, and financial conditions would become very tight. People would stop borrowing right away. Maybe now, for some reason, it's different. I'm going to explain some reason that could have changed. Okay, but first, why is it so hard, or why did I realize it's so hard to measure the economy? The first one is very obvious, but I think until you have to brief someone about it, you don't really realize it. Is in the first place, we don't have the data about current conditions at the time when you need to make a decision. For example, in the US, if you want to look at the November data for inflation, which is our prime interest right now, we'll only get it mid-December to end December. Okay, end December for the measure that we actually care about at the Fed. Another important thing is the labor market. How slack is it? Again, I said there's a lot of job openings in the US right now compared to job seekers. It's something we follow. If you want to know the number of openings in November, you'll have to wait until January 4th. So it's a huge delay, right? So what we're doing is trying to develop more high-frequency indicators. Okay, we look at very specific markets, very specific data sets. It's helpful, but it doesn't really give us a big picture, so you have to combine a lot of these indicators. Second problem, even if you have the data, it's not always what you really want to have. And sometimes it's also hard to know which data you should look at. So in the US, a huge part of what people spend their money on, and I'm sure in Colombia too, is rent. So in the basket of goods and services that Americans pay for, it's around 30% of their spending. So when rents go up, inflation goes up automatically through this 30% pass-through. Now we've seen recently that the cost of rent in the US started to slow down. No, it's still increasing, but it's slowing down, okay? The rate at which it's increasing. So on one hand, you could think, it's good. It means that the policy that you've seen before, increasing the rates, seems to be working. But at the same time, what the Fed targets, the 2% inflation rate, is not just about new leases. It's about what everybody's paying for their rent. And you don't change rent, you don't change your lease every month, right? It takes a while. So even though the new leases are decelerating, average rent is still going to go up for at least one more year compared to the previous year. Which one do you want to look at, right? So that's the kind of question that come up. And finally, even if you have the numbers you want, they still don't tell you the whole story. And a lot of time, what you care about is the story. For example, again, there's too many job openings per job seeker. Say that we see that those job openings go down. What does it mean? Does it mean it's good? Those positions were filled, and now the job market is a little bit more balanced? Good news. Or does it mean that the businesses looked for so long and couldn't find workers, they got discouraged, and they just stopped looking for a worker, which is bad. It doesn't mean that there's any balance in the labor market. Okay? So I think what I learned really is that in my research, typically, and I think in most people's research, we tend to focus on the hard data, statistics, hard numbers. But when it comes to making decisions, especially in this context of having to make quick decisions, lagging data, etc., and understanding the story, soft data is super important. So having surveys where we ask questions to people where they get to actually write sentences to answer, talking to business owners, having anecdotes. And then I guess the talent of those central bankers seems to be really being able to balance between the hard data and those anecdotes, because you don't want to put too much weight on either one. So that was the first big lesson for me. Second one was how this mapping between taking one action to the outcome is not always straightforward. Typically, what you would do is you look in the past. Either very simply, you'd look at what happened in the past, like reading about it, or even you write a model, but the way you would estimate your model would rely on data from the past in any case. Even the most up-to-date models do that. But what if the current situation is so different from past situations that we can't really trust the past? So some reasons for this to be different is first COVID-19 being such a different shock to the economy, different combination of shock together that we haven't seen before. A second one being that a lot of countries are battling inflation at the same time. A lot of countries are doing monetary policy, increasing rates right now. Maybe doing something in a vacuum or in your own country, if other countries are not doing anything else, is different than doing it when a lot of other countries are doing it at the same time. I talked about forward guidance, which is when we say like, oh, we expect that we're gonna keep increasing rates for some time. This is a new tool, relatively, for the US monetary policy, so we don't have that much experience or data to forecast how it would work. And finally, also changes in financial markets. In the end, the way the interest rate transmits to the rest of the economy is gonna go through financial markets. If financial markets behave differently than they did before, then this transmission is gonna change. And that's why we care about financial markets, right? So all are the reasons for it being difficult to just look at the past. And really an example that shows that what happened in the past may be different now is that in the past, with the kind of increase in the interest rate that I showed you before, the job market would have really tanked pretty much. I mean, the unemployment rate would have increased. It's still very low in the US at 3.7%, which is very normal in the US. So the job market is super resilient, right? So it tells us something is different. So now, given we can just look at the past and apply a recipe, what I learned is that maybe the next best thing is to kind of take this trial and error approach, where with the data you have, you act a little bit, you try to assess what's happening in the economy, you revise, you act again, etc. So that would be a rationale for those gradual rate increases. Because if you take an off-the-shelves macro model, or like even the Taylor rule, it would tell you you need to be at, I don't know, 7% interest rate, right? Why don't we just do that right now, right? That's the reason for not doing that. We want to do stuff more gradually to have time to assess, and if we overdo it, then we can correct. A bit like driving a boat, right, a ship. Now, even if you do that, there's still risk to over or underreacting. First, because the delays I mentioned. So maybe next month, we're going to see something in the data that we don't like. Let's say we increase rates too much, but that was 2 months ago that we did that, right? Because the data comes from 2 months ago. So we would know that late. On top of it, any action we take now is going to have an impact later. So this adds even more delays, because there's the delay of having the data, the delay of the policy having an impact. And then in this context where you pretty much are waiting for data to come out to revise your actions, it's super tempting, at least that I learned as a beginner practitioner, to overreact to a new data point. Let's say you see a good news for the inflation rate after lots of bad news, and it's like a victory, and you're like, good, you know, we did it, like we conquered inflation, it's gonna come down now. And then next month, it just goes back up again, right? So I think when you're doing stuff in this gradual fashion, it's really hard to not just react too quickly to one data point. So that's a big lesson that senior people always tell us to keep in mind. You know, don't celebrate too early, right? So I think that's all for my comments today, but happy to take questions, I guess, once everybody's done talking. Thank you, everybody.